July 28, 1944. In a quiet mountain village called Velika, in what is now Montenegro, the war arrived without warning. German SS troops and their collaborators surrounded the village before sunrise. Within hours, homes were burning. Families were dragged outside. And by the end of the day, 428 civilians were dead, most of them women, children, and the elderly. What happened in Velika became one of the most brutal massacres in the Balkans during World War II. But the story didn't end there. Because less than a year later, thousands of the men responsible would face a fate just as sudden, and just as final. To understand what happened in Velika, you have to go back 3 years earlier. In April 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Retribution, a massive invasion meant to crush Yugoslavia in just days. The attack was fast and overwhelming. Within 2 weeks, the country collapsed, and German forces carved the region into occupied territories. But the Balkans were never easy to control. Resistance fighters, partisans, local militias, and underground groups began attacking German patrols, railways, and supply lines. The mountains became a battlefield. And the German response was ruthless. Special SS units were sent into the region to hunt down resistance fighters and punish villages suspected of helping them. One of the most feared among them was the 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division Prinz Eugen, a unit known for brutal anti-partisan operations across the Balkans. By the summer of 1944, as the war slowly began turning against Germany, these units were growing more desperate and far more violent. And it was during one of these retreat operations that the village of Velika suddenly found itself in the path of soldiers who had already decided that mercy was no longer an option. On the morning of July 28, 1944, the village of Velika was still asleep. Velika sat high in the mountains, surrounded by forests and narrow paths that had barely changed for generations. Most of the men in the village were gone, either fighting with the resistance or hiding in the hills to avoid German patrols. That left mostly women, children, and the elderly. Just after sunrise, soldiers began appearing along the ridges above the village. They belonged to the 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division Prinz Eugen, along with elements of the 21st Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Skanderbeg. These were units that had spent years fighting brutal anti-partisan campaigns across Yugoslavia, and by the summer of 1944 they were retreating north as the war slowly began turning against Germany. Velika was directly in their path. To the soldiers moving through the mountains that morning, the village wasn't just a stop along the way. It was suspected of helping resistance fighters. And in Nazi anti-partisan warfare, that accusation alone could be a death sentence. The troops moved in quickly. Witnesses later said the soldiers surrounded Velika from several directions, cutting off the narrow trails that led out of the valley. Anyone trying to flee would run straight into armed patrols waiting along the tree line. Then the killings began. Soldiers forced their way into homes, dragging families outside. Some villagers were shot immediately in the streets. Others were locked inside their houses as the buildings were set on fire. Within minutes, the quiet mountain village had turned into chaos. Gunfire echoed between the hills. Smoke rose from rooftops. People ran through the narrow paths screaming, trying to hide in barns, gardens, and fields. But the soldiers moved through the village methodically. Entire families were gathered together and executed. Elderly men were beaten before being shot. Mothers were killed while holding their children. Some homes were burned with the people still inside. Later testimonies from survivors described scenes so brutal that even investigators struggled to write them down. Children were among the victims. Infants. Entire households wiped out in minutes. By midday, Velika had become a graveyard. Bodies lay scattered along the paths and courtyards. Houses that had stood for generations were reduced to blackened shells. The few survivors hid silently in the woods above the village, watching the smoke rise from what had once been their homes. By the time the soldiers finally moved on, 428 civilians were dead. Most of them had never held a weapon. The massacre would later become known as one of the worst civilian killings in Montenegro during the war. But in the chaos of 1944, events like this were happening across the Balkans, villages punished simply for being suspected of helping resistance fighters. And for the men who carried out the killings that day, there was little fear of consequences. Germany was still fighting the war. The front lines were collapsing in some places, But in the mountains of the Balkans, SS units continued their operations as if nothing had changed. For months after the massacre, many of the soldiers involved simply disappeared back into the retreating German forces. Some would continue fighting until the very last days of the war. Others believed they might eventually blend back into civilian life. But by the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing, and the men of the Prinz Eugen division were about to discover that the survivors of Yugoslavia had not forgotten what happened in Velika. When the soldiers finally left Velika, the village fell silent. For hours, no one moved. A few survivors were still hiding in the forests above the valley, terrified that the troops might return. Only when the smoke began to settle did they slowly make their way back down toward what was left of their homes. What they found was almost impossible to describe. Entire streets were burned. Roofs had collapsed into blackened piles of wood and stone. In courtyards and gardens, bodies lay where they had fallen. Many of the victims were people the survivors had known all their lives, neighbors, relatives, children they had watched grow up. Some survivors later told investigators that the hardest moment wasn't the attack itself. It was the silence afterward. No voices. No movement. Just the smell of smoke and the sound of wind moving through the ruins of the village. Families searched through the wreckage trying to find loved ones. Some found them in burned houses. Others found them in fields and along the narrow dirt paths that led through Velika. In many cases, entire households had been wiped out. The massacre left 428 civilians dead, a number that shocked even communities that had already endured years of war. News of what happened in Velika slowly spread across Montenegro and the surrounding regions of Yugoslavia. Stories from the survivors painted a picture of extreme brutality, soldiers moving from house to house, killing anyone they found. For the people who had lived through it, the memory never faded. But at the time, there was almost no chance of justice. The war was still raging across Europe. German forces were retreating, entire armies were collapsing, and countless crimes committed during the occupation were disappearing into the chaos of the final months of World War II. Many villagers believed the men who destroyed Velika would simply vanish into the end of the war, and never face consequences for what they had done. But less than a year later, something happened that almost no one in Velika expected. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. German armies were retreating on every front. Cities were falling one after another, and thousands of exhausted soldiers were trying to surrender wherever they could. In the Balkans, the forces of Josip Broz Tito and the Yugoslav partisans were rapidly taking control of the region. After years of occupation, the resistance movement had grown into a powerful army determined to reclaim the country. But they were also hunting the units responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the war. Among those units was the 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division Prinz Eugen, the same formation that had carried out brutal anti-partisan campaigns across Yugoslavia, including the massacre at Velika. As Germany collapsed, many of these SS soldiers attempted to retreat north, hoping to surrender to Western Allied forces instead of being captured by the Yugoslavs. Some didn't make it. In May 1945, large groups of captured German soldiers, including members of the Prinz Eugen division, were taken prisoner by Yugoslav forces. Instead of formal trials, many were executed in mass reprisals. According to later accounts, around 2,000 captured soldiers were shot and buried in a mass grave. For the new Yugoslav authorities, this was not seen as revenge, it was seen as punishment for years of massacres, burned villages, and civilian killings carried out during the occupation. For the survivors of places like Velika, the news spread quietly. The men who had marched through their village, who had burned homes and killed entire families, were now dead themselves. There were no courtrooms. No long trials like the ones taking place in Germany. Just a brief moment after the war, when the balance of power shifted, and thousands of soldiers who once believed they would escape justice suddenly found themselves standing in front of firing squads. But the story of those executions would remain buried for decades, along with the men themselves. For decades after the war, the story of what happened to those soldiers remained buried, literally. The mass grave where the executed prisoners had been dumped was largely forgotten as post-war Yugoslavia moved forward under the rule of Josip Broz Tito. In the years that followed, the country rebuilt itself from the devastation of World War II, and many wartime atrocities, on all sides, were rarely discussed publicly. But the memories in places like Velika never disappeared. Families passed the story down to their children and grandchildren. The names of the 428 civilians killed in the massacre were remembered long after the soldiers responsible had vanished from history. Then, in 2010, researchers uncovered a large mass grave believed to contain the remains of roughly 2,000 German soldiers executed near the end of the war. For historians, the discovery reopened a difficult chapter. It was a reminder of how brutal the final days of World War II had become, when years of occupation, massacres, and destroyed villages were finally answered with a form of justice that was just as sudden, and just as final. History rarely forgets, but sometimes justice comes in ways no one expected. If you're interested in forgotten stories from World War II, subscribe for more.